Like really dangerous pinatas, dungeons are full of incredible things that you get when you finally manage to bust them open. And honestly, one of the biggest appeals of going dungeon crawling is seeing what wonders lie within. Today, we are talking all about dungeon loot. Hello everyone, welcome back to Desks and Dorks. I'm Kyle, I'm the Dork. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to, please give us a like, a share, a comment, a subscribe. Those things help us out immensely. And two, if you really want to help us keep the lights on, you can go purchase our games from any of the links below for physical copies or for digital copies on our itch.io page. Now, I know I promised that we would be discussing variant rules and variable rules changes that you can make when you are in a dungeon. I do know that those things are going to be coming out soon. However, when I was making this video, I realized that there was a lot I wanted to say about loot and about how you could stock loot into your dungeon, and as a result, I didn't want to rush those thoughts or those ideas, and so variant loot is going to be the next video in our series, or not variant loot, variant rules are going to be the next video in our series. But without further ado, let's talk all about how you can stock your dungeon. Now, there are three guiding principles that I like to use when I'm putting loot into my dungeons, regardless of the system that I am playing in. So, like monsters, traps, NPCs, the loot should be related to the dungeon. So, for example, a fire-based item in a dungeon that's totally underwater does not make a ton of sense. It should be scaled to the power level of the campaign, not necessarily the players, and it should make the constant puzzle of combat more interesting. Now, one of the things that happened in our last video was I had people that brought up really good exceptions to some of the rules that we were discussing. So I actually included in our video today different ways that you could and should break the rules of these kind of dungeon creation principles when you're feeling more comfortable and you feel like you can play around with the form. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is, again, your loot should be related to the dungeon. What you want to consider first is the environment that you're placing your dungeon in. For example, I use the unprotected parchment in a swamp. Those things rot, depending on how well they're preserved. Now, if it's a, piece of organic matter, a body at the bottom of a peat bog, for example, you might have some chances of getting that preserved. But certain things do not last in certain environments. Two, you need to consider the dungeon's inhabitants when you are considering your loot. For example, if you are hacking through a wizard's laboratory and there are health potions everywhere, that makes sense because the wizard's laboratory might be protected by constructs. However, if you're breaking into a fort, there's probably not going to be a ton of health potions left because, those warriors might particularly use them. The same thing goes for weapons that are obviously magical and useful, or tools that might help give somebody the upper hand. Now, again, consider that the inhabitants of these dungeons probably want to remain alive, and as such are going to use every advantage to their disposal, to stay alive. That includes some of the items inside of the dungeon. So, consider those things very, very much. When should you break this rule? Now, I'm going to just go out on a limb and tell you all this right now. Most of the time when you are breaking these rules, it is because you are trying to invest heavily into the environmental storytelling that you as a game master are trying to make happen. What do I mean by that? Almost all of the times that you should break these rules, it's because it reveals something important about the NPCs in the game, something important about the player's mission, something important about the characters themselves. These are all great ways to break a rule, and in fact, honestly, the best reason to break a rule is because you want to do something in the story. You want to create greater meaning in the story or continue to shift the action in a story forward. So, for example, a constantly burning torch in an underwater dungeon might tip off the fact to the players that this is just an elaborate illusion that they are trapped in. Or, for example, another really, really good one that I liked was my players were going through a dungeon that was mostly arcane based, and so this is not Dungeons & Dragons, but it was a system where wizards were still around. They started to find religious artifacts, which did not make a ton of sense, given the fact that the monster, or main villain, antagonist, whatever you want to call them, was a wizard, until they realized that, oh gosh, not only is this person a wizard, it's the cult leader that we have been looking for. Those religious the religious iconography, the religious equipment there belonged to him because he was actually having a dual role within this place that he lived. That was a really good way to reveal something important about one of the characters. The other thing you can consider is how might this item last because of extra features. So for example, we have found scrolls in real life in swamps because those scrolls were in wax sealed tubes that protected them from the elements. That might be a reason that you could have something in an environment that it wouldn't make sense to usually have it in. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, you need to have them scaled to the power of the game. One of the things that I think Dungeons & Dragons does poorly is it scales items to the players. Now, you might think that that's a little bit backwards, but consider for a moment that magic items can actually be incredibly useful and also kind of be double-edged swords. I like to think about it as like an idiot with a magic nuke. That's part of the reason I really like Flayo and Shadow of the Demon Lord, is a lot of those items in that game are really powerful, but they are also potentially harmful to the players, sometimes as harmful or more harmful to the players as they are to the monsters themselves. So when you are putting items into your campaign, and especially into your dungeons, consider the power level of the game world that you want to create. If you want a world that has incredibly powerful items, the players should not be shocked when the enemies come at them with powerful items. If you want a world with incredible magic that also carries with it great consequence, the players should be prepared to, tank a ton of damage, get hurt, have their magic items have gigantically adverse effects. All of that might work too. But again, the one thing I'm going to tell you is once you pick a lane, stay in it for consistency. If you were playing a low fantasy setting, for example, you probably don't want everybody running around with a, magical card captor Sakura wand or something along those lines. However, just like everything else, there are definitely exceptions to this rule and reasons that you should break it for the interest of your campaign. The first one is, I think, when it reveals something about a character. So, for example, a quote-unquote bad guy character giving up a powerful magic item or destroying it or using it improperly is a way to show growth or change. For example, the bad guy giving up some sort of doomsday weapon, right, because they want to turn over a new leaf. That is a huge move in that character's backstory. Or when you're reaching your final conclusion. This is a term that I believe I coined this. I have not heard this elsewhere, so I'm going to say that I did. But this is called ludonarrative pressure, and I want to talk a little bit about it. It's one of my favorite things that games do, and really good games do this really well. So the idea of ludonarrative pressure is that as the game is progressing, the game will break its own rules or warp its own systems to ramp up intensity or to show that the game is actually growing in danger, and it usually happens right when you're about to ramp up into the end game. A great example of this is actually in video games. If anyone has ever played the Far Cry series, you will know that Far Cry, you are usually spending most of your time, at least in the early Far Crys, cobbling together a makeshift arsenal, hiding, sneaking, and trying really hard not to die, until you get to the end game, where the game starts to break its rules, and instead of scavenging, hiding, and striking from the shadows with your limited arsenal, it gives you access to incredible stuff, like war elephants with mounted machine guns, Apache attack helicopters, RPGs with unlimited ammo. It's a way that the game is trying to tell you, hey, these carefully constructed rules that we have used to build this environment and build a sense of unease and tenseness to it are changing rapidly. And they're changing rapidly, which means the player, whether they realize it or not, consciously or subconsciously, starts to feel different about the game, which again leads to the idea that the end game is going to feel different. If you are starting to get to the end of your game, regardless of the system you're playing, breaking these rules can make the pressure spike. And I think that's a good thing. So, now, last but certainly not least, strengthening the puzzle of combat. You know that I think combat should be a puzzle. And every time that you are giving your players magical loot, specifically items, powers, things that aren't just whatever the raw currency of the world is, I think that you should be trying to look to give them ones that change the flow of combat in ways that are that go beyond stat bonuses, I should say. So for example, like a +2 sword is never going to be as interesting as something that lets the players switch places with a single target as a response, like once per combat or something along those lines. So I actually wanted to include a couple really great examples from different games. The Decanter of Endless Water is one that I love from Dungeons & Dragons because it allows players to do fun stuff with that water geyser, knock people off their feet, cure water problems in a village to open up diplomatic ties. You can strap 2 decanters of endless water to a bat pack to make a jet pack. I've seen it done. There's all kinds of stuff that you can use the decanter of endless water for that makes it so much more interesting and intriguing than a simple, +2 whatever. +2 whatever. That's what we're going with. The item swap spell from Flaeo is another great one. This is one that actually allows players to swap 2 items of not equivalent size, but close to it, if they're both being held by 2 different characters. I have seen this used to devastating effect. One character was an alcoholic wizard who had sort of given up on magic and had gone into a life of dissolution. And then when somebody held up a flintlock pistol to kill that wizard, the wizard decided, not today. And they actually swapped the spell, or swapped the items with the spell as the gun is going off mid-shot, and that's how they managed to get the drop on a very powerful enemy. Actually just end them instantly with a flintlock. So I think that spell is awesome. Stuff like that. There are scrolls that do this in other fantasy games, or if you want to give players access to that power as a reward, temporary or permanent, during the dungeon, that's a cool thing. Clockwork wasps, or any of the tiny clockwork creatures that you can employ in Shadow of the Demon Lord are awesome, because they work kind of like early familiars in D&D, where you can sometimes share line of sight with these characters, which makes them perfect for scouting out things, doing ambushes, again, gaining information at a regular time. All of the monsters from A Fear Within, I'm going to shill my own game for a second, but part of the reason I like playing Fear Within with people is all of the monsters have powers that make combat way more interesting, and it's stuff that you sort of check out with each other and with your game master before you start playing. So I don't think I've ever played a single version of Fear Within where the combat wasn't completely scuffed in the best possible way, because players were able to work out powers with the monsters that they had. That's always a good thing too. Again, you want to be looking for ways, if you're going to give your players items, especially magical ones, you want to be looking at ways to replicate some of the stuff that we talked about here, or create excitement in other ways. Remember, combat should feel like a puzzle, and if you are giving your players interesting and compelling tools to solve that puzzle, it's going to go a long way in your games. Now, when can you break this rule? So, when it's time for caveman style fun, listen, I love smart combat. It's one of the things that I've enjoyed the most, but sometimes I don't want to go and play Final Fantasy Tactics. Sometimes I don't want to make, Hannibal Barca-esque military schemes. Sometimes I want to hit big thing with big stick. There is a tiny part of my lizard brain that goes, yes, the big stick, hit the big thing and make a big noise. And honestly, that's good. That's an okay thing to have in your games. I think sometimes as game masters, we might get caught up a little bit in everything just needs to be smart, or everything needs to be connected, or everything needs to be fancy. This is high art. And sometimes it's not high art. Sometimes it's I move forward and I hit thing with big stick. And that is a pure expression of joy. And sometimes your players are going to need that, and they're not going to want the really interesting, compelling combat item. They're going to want the +2 sword. Don't be afraid to give it to them just because you want to do cool stuff all the time. Sometimes your players are like, I really want to just hit stuff. This is a thing that is going to take a little bit of time for you as a game master to get used to, because only you can gauge how your party is feeling. Sadly, I'm not there with you to do it for you. But if your players look like they're starting to want some caveman style fun, that's a good thing. 2, not every player wants to engage with combat as a higher level puzzle, or even role-playing games as a higher level puzzle. I usually have at least 1 or 2 people in my games, regardless of what system I'm playing, that are there because they like their friends, they're there because they want to try it, they're there just to kind of vibe, to be honest. And those players are usually the ones that wind up getting my +2 longsword. Now, sometimes I will occasionally, push them, give them items to see, maybe they want to try to broaden their horizons today or do something different. But 9 times out of 10, they usually don't, and that's totally okay. There is a place at the table for players like that. And in fact, some of my favorite players I've ever GM'd for are players like that, because they're not looking for Shakespeare or Critical Role or, Desks and Dorks. They're just looking to have a fun time with their friends, knock back a couple beverages, maybe crush some pizza, and have a good time. Those players usually get some of my simpler items, and I try to make sure that they get those because you know, not only do I want them to feel welcome at my table, I think that's super, super important. I think everyone should feel welcome at your table, but I also want to make sure that they're going to get stuff that they can use and that there's some sort of sense of progression for them. And those players sometimes can benefit from simpler items just because it's what they want to engage with. And again, I want to say this one more time. That is a totally okay thing to do. There is no player that is better or worse than any other type of player, so long as everyone is treating each other with respect. As far as I'm concerned, if you're here to play a role-playing game, congratulations, you did it. You are playing the game as intended. Now, I'm going to go pass it over to Camera Kyle. We're going to talk about adding some items to our dungeon, and we'll talk soon. Thanks, narration Kyle. So, if you're confused as to why we're looking at this castle map, you should go back and check the previous videos in our series. Could be potentially really important for you, but we're actually working on stocking a castle full of a bandit army, and so we have been working with this particular map over the last 3 videos. That's why it's here. So, let's talk about stocking this with some items. Now, traditionally what I like to do is I like to make a map key for my items if I'm going to do anything. So I'm just going to go put 1. That's a terrible color. Let's do something that pops a little more. There we go. Let's do that dark blue. Love that. So we're going to put 1 item there. We're going to put a 2nd item here. And then I'm going to put a 3rd item somewhere in this room. Now again, you can play around fast and loose with where your items go. Or what I like to do, honestly, is I like to have item descriptions, but not item locations. So one of the big, I don't want to call it a cheat, but one of the big secrets to being a GM is that you'll realize that it's your responsibility to keep the game flowing. And so sometimes, if you notice that combat is dragging, if you notice the players are looking a little sluggish, if they're starting to lose them a little bit, man, that might just be the right time for them to find a crazy magic item or something really useful in combat. And so sometimes I won't even put them into rooms. Sometimes I'll just have the item descriptions or a vague idea of what I want each item to do, and I'll have the players encounter it when I feel like they need to. But I know a lot of people like this, so I'm just going to put them here and we'll talk about what each one does. So again, this is a bandit fortress. This is a place that used to be a fully functioning castle, and now it has been left abandoned. So let's talk about what each of these items do. So number 1, I want number 1 to be goggles. Or actually, let's do number 3. I want these to be goggles that allow the players to see through loose stone walls or thin material. Now, why do I want this? 1, this opens up a wealth of different combat possibilities, both for this game and for future games, right? It's really interesting if the players now all of a sudden have a lesser form of X-ray vision, and what can they do with that? I'm not sure, and your players are, I guarantee, going to come up with some really cool ideas and some really cool concepts on how that actually works. I think that would be really interesting to sort of see that happen. 2, the reason I want to include it in this dungeon is if you were following along with our series, you'll know that the players might find that there are walls that have been loosely bricked up by the bandits. This means that there is a material use to these items for this particular dungeon, i.e., seeing through the walls that the bandits decided to make. I'm going to circle 1 for us. But also that it carries on later into your adventures because, again, this is a power that might lend itself to really interesting ideas. Now, 2, for 2, I think I'm just going to make 2... I think I'm just going to make 2 be some form of currency. Now, again, I don't love gold as an RPG currency, but it makes some amount of sense to have the leader of these bandits have some form of currency in their game right there, right? They're holed up in there. It's the highest floor of the castle. We established that last time, and we decided that the bandit leader was actually going to have some sort of lair up on the top of the castle. I want it to have currency there. I think it makes the most sense to do so, whether that's gold or favors or something else, depending on the system that you are playing. That's something I think should be there. And last but certainly not least, let's do number 1. And again, the reason I'm doing number 1 last is it's the first one that, or it's the last one the players are going to encounter. Again, you could maybe finagle this. You could make 1 here, but it doesn't really matter. As long as you, the game master, know, it does not matter at all. So number 1, we discussed that this is actually a walled off chapel. The bandits walled it off when they realized that there was a construct that actually can guard the chapel and was maybe potentially responsible for knocking out or killing a couple of them. So they walled it off with the hopes that they'd never have to deal with that construct again. And because the construct is in a chapel, the construct we established last video looks like a religious icon or religious figure, I'm going to give this item a religious bent. I'm going to say candles that once lit make it so no one can lie. Lasts 15 minutes. One use. Only affects beings that need to breathe. Now, again, part of the reason I wanted to make this interesting is that's a really powerful ability, especially if you have a diplomacy or a negotiation-centered character in your system. Making it so no one is able to lie is huge. However, it also means that they are not able to lie. It's a double-edged sword. The cool part about this, though, is that players, and you'll figure this out the more you GM, will find really interesting ways to make your double-edged swords single-edged as heck. And so I want this item to be something that the players can use and abuse in really creative ways. I want to reward them for creative problem solving and for engaging with the game world in a real and holistic way. Two, I like it being one use because it's very powerful. I want to sort of limit the amount of uses they get out of something so potent as a weapon or as an item. And I also think it's interesting that it only works on characters that breathe because, of course, they have to inhale the holy incense in that candle. That's what's going to make that interesting. I think those are good items, and I think I'm good with that. I would be very happy if I was a player and I got these two items and some currency to go along with it. And I think that's going to end us for today. Now, I'm going to pass it back to Narration Kyle. He's going to tell you what we're talking about next time. Over to you, Narration Kyle. Thanks, Camera Kyle. It's Narration Kyle, and I'm here to tell you that we are going to be working on variant rules next time. That's right, I'm going to tell you how to actually change the systems in your games to make your dungeons even more memorable and more interesting. It's my favorite thing about dungeon creation, so you definitely don't want to miss this one. If you've liked this series, you will like the next video, I promise. I am so stoked to talk about variant rules. If you feel like we deserve it, give us a like, a share, a comment, a subscribe. Those things go a long, long way to helping a small channel such as ours. If you want to help us keep the lights on, you can actually go and purchase our RPGs in the links in the description below. But until next time, I am Kyle out for Desks and Dorks. You have been awesome. And before I tell you the last part, make sure you join the Discord community. We have a Discord community, and actually we're running some dungeon contests there. So if you want to be part of the community, talk RPG design, talk contests, and just hang out, join that. But again, Kyle out for Desks and Dorks. You've all been amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.